one of the fundamental assumptions of academia has been for all of my life, and perhaps most of the life of my father, is that there has never been any interruption in the natural processes. The natural processes have always gone on from the beginning of time, and with never anything that might be called a miracle or a singularity, and there's no such thing as a spirit being or a spirit world. This is a natural fundamental assumption of academia. Now, it was so entrenched when I was a kid that every story that had anything to do with the supernatural always had a natural explanation to end. No exceptions. And that was true of comic newspapers. I mean, whether it be the Phantom or, they would have a witch story, but at the end there was always a natural explanation. It wasn't until Dark Shadows came along in the late 1960s, I mean, they had a movie about Dark Shadows recently, that they had a witch story that did not have any kind of a natural explanation to end on it. The person, whose name I won't call, but who turned the paper in this morning, it was a well-done paper. Really well-deserved high grade, but followed the line, the theme that there's natural explanation for everything, and the only phenomenon that exists in the universe is a natural phenomenon based on all the laws of science, and these laws have never been interrupted from the beginning. Now, again, if you take that view, and that's the standard view of academia, that's fine and dandy. I understand, and you can take it. I will not dock your grade for it. But some of the logic that we use, there's one case of fairly bad logic. Now, I've seen this logic used by high-up people with PhDs in my reading. A lot of the grave sites that they dig up the graves, and they find that these people died of diseases, rickets, and deformities, arthritis, and they had all kinds of problems. Is that necessarily indicative of the way they lived? We have people today who die horrible deaths after long, long illnesses. Does that mean they had these illnesses all their life? Now, in some cases, like spinal bifida, things like that, they were probably born with it. Or they were born with it and had it all their life. But the graves have, it's like any other source of archaeology. You have your limits as to what you can tell about people by looking at the way they're buried. There are limitations, even though and also the graves that we dig up, are they representative examples? Are we overlooking the evidence that might point the other way? Particularly the evidence of how were some of these stone structures we've talked about built. How were the pyramids built? How was the Stonehenge built? How were those stones moved? Evidence that these people might have been highly advanced, and yet to us, their beliefs sound superstitious and primitive. And we're going to run into this even worse when we get to the Greeks, and when we get to the Romans, and when we get to the Indian people. Not so much with the Chinese, but the Chinese literature is flooded with dragon stories, and with stories that we would call fairy tales and mythologies. No offense to any of you who might read Chinese, because every society begins its history with stories that we today call mythologies. Hardly any exceptions. All right, anybody else have any comments? I'll answer a question I answered before, but somebody asked this morning. You do not need to bring in any paper for the test. I'll furnish it all. Yes? You have anybody else have any of these contracts? Or, now, I've had better response on this than ever. I've had 2 persons show me evidence that they attended last Thursday's symposium, and again, it was awfully short notice, but they'll be going on every Thursday night from now on until March the 5th. So, yeah. So, again, your chance to boost your grade by a couple points for each symposium that you attend. That's, again, 2 persons attending so far, and it's early in the semester. that's somewhat encouraging. All right, anybody else have any comments? Questions? Okay, yes?
What's the format of the test?
Basically, the format, I'm glad you asked that. I mean, but I've tried to answer it. I put a word here, and you define it. Down here, the word can be a name, and it can be a place name, the name of a person. I have a few questions, like name 4 or 5 things that constitute a civilization. Again, I do not know if you will get that question or not. Because what I'm going to do, come Monday morning early, pull out one of the test booklets and give it to the morning class, and then you'll get the one that's left. I made up more than 50 questions, it turned out. I mean, I told you initially 48, but it wound up being more than 50. You'll get half, the other class gets the other half. So which questions you'll get out of it? Basically, I mean, you'll see a word on there, a name of a person. Here, Moses. When you see Moses, what kind of response would you give? I mean, David, write down what you know about David. If you can, anything within the ballpark, anything close. Now, the answers will have about 4 points apiece. Sometimes I might knock off 1 point for something or another that I think is wrong. Not for spelling or grammar, not here. On the paper you turn in, definitely yes. On this, no. Again, Moses I'll be talking about in a minute. David, the same thing, Assyria. But that's basically the format. You just simply write the answers down. No, there are no multiple choice questions. None. Again, I've had students complain for years that they don't do well on multiple choice, and I finally decided maybe they were right. Now, again, when I say no multiple, that's no multiple choice. That only applies to this test Wednesday. It does not apply to the future. So don't say I told you. Yeah, there will be no multiple choice questions for test.
Study guide.
Study guide. There is a study guide for the pass on iCollege. That's the only study guide I plan to give out. I might change my mind later. If we have a big snowstorm, or something like I did last year, I might have to make adjustments, yes.
Can you make study guides for the other stuff? Because I find it's, if I have a study guide, while I'm reading the chapter, I know what things to look for. Instead of like overloading with information, like I'm just going to like rewrite the chapter in my notebook.
You've got a valid point. Because, I mean, I'm going to stick to what I said. I mean, I've had a lot of pressure on me about study guides. I mean, I've dealt with it. For the first, I've taught here for 14 and a half years, and the first 8 I gave study guides. I mean, I used to think, I once sat in your shoes, and I think, wouldn't it be wonderful if teachers did? Then as time went on, I realized they actually create more problems than they solve. But you'll be on the same level playing field with everybody else. But they do create, number one, they just encourage you to not read the book for some students, and for others, they encourage you to not buy the book. And also it looks bad on me. It cost me a job, I'm telling you, in no uncertain term. Not here, but it cost me a job in another school. So you're opening up a really...
Well, do you, like in class, do you touch on everything that would be testable material?
If it's not in the book, and if I don't touch on it, on occasion, if I find out that I've asked a question, it's not in the book, I don't touch on it, I'll give everybody credit for it. That happens maybe once every 2 or 3 semesters down the road. It does happen. There's one, oops, I thought I mentioned this, and no, oops, I didn't. It can happen, but I'll make sure I throw it out. And of course, what I say in class is documented and recorded.
Okay.
Yes?
So you can tell us what's unnecessary to read in the book?
That's what I've been doing the last 3 times, and I'm about to do it again.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, in other words, the study guides I've been giving out answers to the test for almost 4 hours already with another hour to go. Yeah, I've been giving out answers. Again, I don't know which set of questions you'll get, but it's all, yes?
Are both the projects that we have to do, are they both going to be where we're correcting your errors and papers?
Yes. And I say that tongue-in-cheek because I have not really started on Project 2 yet. Now, I've done some serious thinking about it in light of something I've read just over the weekend. about Mohenjo-Daro, which we'll talk about come Monday of next week. Mohenjo-Daro in India. And I'm thinking that might be the next project, Mohenjo-Daro. Very, very important to me. All right, I'll tell you right now what I'm thinking about the next project. There is a story that Mohenjo-Daro was atom bombed, just like in the case of Earth. I'm going to give you a bunch of sources on the pros and the cons. To me, the persons who are against that theory have a weak argument. That some of the buildings are left standing, yes, but then if you look closer, there's a blast area where the buildings in the blast area are not standing. The ones on the fringe are. But the cons do not tell about the blast area. They just say, well, the buildings are left standing. The con argument is kind of weak. All right, I've said more than I intended to say about the next project. That is what I'm thinking of being the next project. All right, anyway, any other questions? We got to move on. Children of Israel. The big contribution of Israel to civilization was the belief in monotheism, which I am going to elaborate on in a little bit. But first I'll follow the format your book does and give a brief outline of their history. According to their own stories, they were descended from 3 wandering herdsmen who left the land of Mesopotamia and lived in the land of Canaan. Their names were Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Then during a time of famine, and if I go through with the project and talk of famine, it'll be a big part of the next project. But anyway, during a time of famine, they all went to Egypt, where they found some food stored up. And they stayed in Egypt for 400 years. At the end of 400 years, they left Egypt under leadership of a man named Moses. Now, I want to elaborate on Moses a little bit. According to some sources, the name Moses means drawn up from the water. We have 3 persons in ancient history who, as babies, thrown into a boat and left afloat and were found by somebody and rescued. One of them I already mentioned was Sargon of Agad, King Sargon, who wound up building himself a big empire. He was found by some shepherds. The next one is Moses. The third one is Cyrus, whom I will talk about before the class is over. In the case of Moses, he was floated down the Nile River, and he was found by the daughter of the Pharaoh, and Pharaoh's daughter adopted him, brought him up in her palace, and he was educated among the Egyptian scholars and learned all the ways of the Egyptians. Then at 40 years of age, he ran from the Egyptian Pharaoh, went to live in the Arabian desert for a time, and then went from the Arabian desert back to Egypt and told the Pharaoh to let the children of Israel go. Pharaoh initially refused, but after 10 plagues, the Pharaoh let them go. And they went in, and after a long spell in the land of, roaming around the wilderness for 40 years, they went into the land of Canaan. Now Moses is also remembered as the lawgiver, who wrote the first 5 books of the Old Testament, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And he told the children of Israel how to sacrifice, how to live. A lot of his laws can be found in Egyptian law, which has led some scholars to say that he copied from Egyptian law. I'm not going to say he didn't. Even though not everything that Egyptian law had in it, Moses copied. A lot of the laws also are found in Hammurabi's law. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. If you knock out someone's tooth, your tooth will be knocked out. If you put out someone's eye in a fight, your eye shall also be knocked out. Which is also found in Hammurabi's law. And since Moses was a well-educated man, educated in all the knowledge at that time, it is possible that he had access to all the records from the time period. And Hammurabi would have probably lived some time before he did. So, anyway, he gave them the law, and they went into Canaan and conquered part of Canaan. Now, they did not conquer it all. The Philistines, they were never able to conquer. and the Phoenicians who lived in Tyre and Sidon, this region here today we call Lebanon. The Israelis were never able to conquer that land either. There were some people who remained who remained in the land. Now, as justification for their conquest, they said that the people living in the land were practicing witchcraft and divination, all of which was offensive to the Jews at the time. But equally as bad, if actually worse, the young women were prostituting themselves in the temple as a way of honoring their God through temple sex, which was a big part of ancient religion, folks. Your book does not mention it, but I will. The babies that were born from these sexual unions were often burned in the fire as a sacrifice to their gods. A practice that the Jews found reprehensible, to say the least. And they used this as justification for driving the Canaanites out of the land of Canaan. And there is a rumor that some of the Canaanites found their way into places like England and France and Spain. But be that as it may, a lot of them were driven out of Canaan. And then the Israelis came in and settled down. Now, this idea of a nomadic people coming in and taking over a place, folk, in the 21st century, even in which we frowned on it, but this was a very super widespread practice before the year 1900. And even in the United States, the Europeans came in and drove the Indians into the reservations and took over. I mean, so my own ancestors are just as guilty of as anyone else. And yes, as I trace my genealogy, some of my ancestors were Indian fighters. You can decide for yourself whether it was right or wrong. The fact is, it's the way humanity has conducted himself and his affairs all the way down through time. People will be driven out of their own homeland by drought or famine or starvation, and will go where they can find food. And if the people where they go visit are not careful or are not strong or have allowed themselves to atrophy, become weak, the newcomers will drive them out. This has happened time and time and time and time again throughout history. And I would suspect it's going to happen again. No. It's only been about this time last year. I had a student sit right in this class, right on the front row here, and say the United States can't be conquered. Nobody in the class agreed with him. I don't agree with that either. I know I'm talking to a classroom where a lot of you are not Americans. Every nation, sooner or later, falls. And most of the time they fall from within. And not because some outsider came in and conquered them. I'll be saying more about that as the semester goes on. All right, anyway, the Israelis conquered the land of Canaan, settled in it for a while. At first, they were ruled by judges. Then they decided to have a king. The most famous king of all of them was King David. David built himself up an empire that extended from the border of Egypt all the way to the Euphrates River. It was not as large as the empires of the Babylonians, the Assyrians, or as large as Hammurabi's. Certainly nothing near the size of Alexander the Great's empire that came later, but it was a promising kingdom. But then, yes? Say it again? Oh, what page am I on? I'm looking at page 27. David's name is listed there on page 27. David defeated the Philistines, established control over Canaan. He did not drive the Philistines out, and they were to make a comeback. That is the Philistines. The word Palestinian, by the way, comes from the ancient Philistines. The word. So when we talk about the Palestinians today, some people believe that they're the same as the Philistines of bygone time. Anyway, they eventually had a king. David is remembered, among other things, for killing the giant Goliath. If you believe the story, Goliath was 9 feet tall, taller than anyone is known to get today in 6 cubits, a cubit being 1.5 feet, so that would be 9 feet. Again, I have to say, folks, giant stories are found all over the globe. That people have long believed that they existed in ancient times. Anyway, David became the king. Under his son, some people rebelled and they formed 2 kingdoms. The northern kingdom of Israel in the north and the southern kingdom of Judah. The kingdom of Israel lasted 300 years, and eventually a group of people called the Assyrians. Assyria carried Israel captive. Now, I want to elaborate on that a little bit. These people who conquered did not want to just go in and obliterate everyone. Now, sometimes they did. Sometimes they'd go into a place and kill everything alive, man, woman, child, beast, or whatever. But sometimes they reasoned, hey, if we kill them, if we can't collect tax money from them, let them collect some wealth, and we'll collect taxes from their wealth. But they realized if they kept these people together, they rebel. So they would take the upper classes, all the royalty, nobility, and the educated people, and transport them many miles away and scatter them out, reasoning that once scattered, they'd never get back together again and rebel. And this was a widespread practice, practiced by the Assyrians, the Babylonians, who came later. Anyway, Israel was carried captive by Assyria, and we don't know for sure what happened to them. Now, the best theory I've seen is that they were carried all the way up here to the Volga River. And yes, we do find a Jewish community on the Volga who claim that they're descended from the original captives. But they were carried some distance away and never found their way back home. I mean, again, from in ancient times, the distance from Israel here would have been a long, long way. But they never found their way back home. Now, the Assyrians then went on to try to conquer Judah. According to the biblical account, an angel came and destroyed most of the Assyrian army, and when a few of them who were left rose up early in the morning, they found a whole bunch of dead corpses and they had to leave. There is another account that says a pestilence hit the camp, and the pestilence destroyed most of them. Herodotus, the Greek historian, says that rats came in and ate the bowstrings, and with the bowstrings gone, the Assyrians had no means to really effectively fight against the walled city of Jerusalem. Anyway, the Assyrians failed to conquer Judah, so Judah was to last another 100 years. Then 100 years later, Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar's father had helped destroy the Assyrian Empire, but Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon came in and he carried the kingdom of Judah captive. That is, he carried away the upper classes to Babylon and to Medo-Persia, to this region right here and this region right here, and scattered them out throughout much of the kingdom, and left behind only the poor people of the land, reasoning the poor people would never get together a rebellion or rise up. And this was the way that these people subjugated the people whom they conquered. All right. Under Cyrus, whom we'll talk about in a little bit, Cyrus allowed the Judeans to return. Judah then returned from captivity and rebuilt their nation. It was to last until AD 70. It was conquered by the Romans. Before AD 70, it was conquered. Actually, the Romans fought them 3 times, in 63 BCE, in 70 CE, and again in 135 CE. And eventually the Romans scattered the Jews all over the world, all over the known world. And the Jews then will remain scattered until 1948, when after World War II they reassembled as a nation. All right, I will be having more to say about the Jewish scattering as when we come to the chapter on Roman history. But that's a brief history of their politics. They were in Israel for a time, scattered, reassembled, and then scattered again, and reassembled again, which is something you can hardly find for any other group of people in history. The biggest contribution, though, that they made was their belief in monotheism. Again, I have talked about what I think are the practical sides of monotheism. Practical in it, their belief that nature was not God, that nature obeyed the laws of God, but nature, God maintained a separate existence from nature. Again, I think that's very important in the development of technology, a belief that there is some regularity and order in the universe, and you have to have this regularity, or at least you have to have this belief in regularity and order in order to develop any kind of technology where you put together a second automobile just like the first one. The second one will do the same thing the first one does. I mean, if you put it together the same way, it will. Or put together a radio like another radio the same way that another one's put together, and the second radio will do the same thing the first one does. So, again, because of our belief in regularity and orderliness. Now, there are some things about a universe that are not seemingly so regular and ordered. And I want to talk a little bit about the weather. When I was a kid, they bragged that they could forecast tomorrow's weather accurately 6 days out of 7. But they said, we'll be able to forecast it more accurately if we could get a few satellites into orbit and make better computers. All right, fast forward 50 years. We have numerous weather satellites watching the globe. We have more than probably hundreds of thousands of weather computers. And today, we can forecast tomorrow's weather with an accuracy of 6 times out of 7. Our accuracy forecast has not changed that much in the last 50 years. When we got all this data. Temperature, barometric pressure, wind speed, wind direction. Well, they used to have just one computer. Now they have several. They have computer models. This model says that tomorrow's weather is going to be this. Well, that computer model says tomorrow's weather is going to be that. And over here is another computer who says something else. So they try to put together, well, there'll be a 60% chance of rain. Maybe they used to predict just rain, but now they say, 45% chance of rain. Basically, weather forecasting is not an exact science. I want to bring that up. Well, forecasting what grade you'll make on Wednesday's test is not an exact science either. You're dealing with some things in this universe that are regular, orderly, predictable, and some things that are not. Maybe weather forecasting get better someday. I'm going to have more to say about weather, particularly climate change, as we go on. But I'll leave that for a later time. All right, the Jewish religion was also concerned with morals. The law of Moses promised that if you obey these laws, you'll become great, you'll be prosperous and healthy, and if you disobey them, you'll be punished. There'll be punishment for the disobedient. Again, you don't find this as much in the ancient world. What you find in other parts of the ancient world is if you can simply placate to gods, please them, offer a sacrifice, that will make them happy and you'll go well. But it had little to do with morality. Morals and religion were not connected until the time of Moses, or so it seems. Now, folk, I've read several commentaries by atheists who say that somewhere along the way morality got hijacked by religion, and they say we want a standard of morality without religion. One of them had a title of this article, "We don't need God to be good." That's great and good, except for what happens is every group of people makes up their own standard of morality, and nobody can agree on what a moral standard should be. In the case of the Jews, their moral standard was based on, well, this is what God said, and that was the basis for their morality. All right. They blamed their captivities on failing to obey the law of Moses, particularly the northern kingdom said, we just cannot worship God the way you do because Jerusalem is the only place to worship, and Jerusalem was still under the control of Judea. So after 300 years, Israel was carried captive, and the prophets who wrote about it blamed it on their forsaking the God of Moses, the God of Abraham. And eventually the same thing happened to Judah. When they were carried captive, they blamed it on their failing to obey the law of Moses. And when they came back from their captivity, they vowed never to have any more issues with idolatry. And from that time to this, for the most part, the Jews have not had any issues with idolatry. All right. Moving on then, and believe me, I could spend the entire semester talking about Jewish history, at least Jewish history up until the year AD 135 or CE 135. After that, I don't know much about it, I have to admit. But this is a world history class, and we'll move on. Assyria. On a personal note, I have taken some keen interest in the Assyrians, and I've learned in research that there are 10 million people alive today who claim that they're Assyrians. They live here in the region of what is today eastern Turkey, northern Iraq, and maybe a little bit in Armenia. They're closely associated with the Kurds. How many of them are now involved in fighting ISIS? I'm not sure, but they live in the region of ISIS, and I keep wondering, when are they going to assert themselves and make news? The only time in my life they made news was in the late 1970s when some Assyrian terrorists went on a rampage and held a few hostages, but they were all killed. But otherwise, you just don't hear anything about the Assyrians in the modern world. Not so at the time we're talking about. They lived in the region, a wide open plain in this region right here, near the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. Because their land was so open, they were subject to invasion, so they knew all about fear, and they developed a strong army to hold off their enemies, and they actually controlled a very large empire for a few hundred years. Actually, the Assyrian Empire lasted 1,000 years, all told. It wasn't strong all that time, but it became really strong during the 700s BC before the Common Era, 600s before the Common Era. One of the things that made them strong was the use of iron. Now, I've already mentioned the people who are credited with inventing or discovering the use of iron are the Hittites. And I would not be surprised if that would have proved to be untrue later. I mean, it's just a part of life. What I'm teaching here now, what your book teaches, might prove to be untrue. But nevertheless, the Hittites are credited with having discovered iron. But then the Assyrians took up iron. And if you can imagine two men fighting a sword fight, the one of them using a bronze sword and the other one using an iron sword, you can pretty well guess which one was going to win. The man with the iron sword, if he hits the bronze sword hard enough, he's going to cut it in two and leave the man with the bronze sword more or less defenseless. Not only did they use swords and spears of iron, well, an iron spearhead would be a little bit heavier than a bronze spearhead, so that if it hit a person, it would do more, injure him more than a bronze head would. But also they used chariots that had iron wheels. The iron wheels were sharpened to a point to where they'd cut a person to pieces if the wheels rolled over them. I mean, it sounds cruel, it sounds gross, but this was the way they fought their wars. A chariot was like a modern-day tank on a battlefield. The charioteer was protected fairly well from enemy arrows, and the horse and chariot could ride into battle and make havoc of the enemy coming at them, again by the wheels slicing an enemy to pieces. So iron was a big thing that made the Assyrians strong. Anyway, the Assyrians are credited with carrying away Israel, the northern kingdom, captive, and they attempted to carry away the southern kingdom also, but failed in that attempt. They had to continuously fight rebellions, and if you look at a detailed account of their history, you'll find in the third year of King such and such, keep in mind, these people kept their history by according to the year that the king had reigned. So in the 3rd year of Shalmaneser, Shalmaneser went on a campaign to put down a rebellion among these northern peoples called the Scythians. Then in the 4th year of Shalmaneser, he went and put down a rebellion among the Babylonians, and so on and so forth. And they spent their time in the spring. Their armies would assemble, go out and fight, and then they'd return in the fall, rest over the winter time, and then go out and fight in the spring. And the warfare was somewhat continuous. Now, there's another aspect about the Assyrians, and folks, this will not be on the test, it's not in the book, but I think I need to mention this. I kept running into this over and over again as I would read about Assyria when I was in college. We're going to find this same thing when we come to Mohenjo-Daro. In the case of Mohenjo-Daro, it appears that these people were classless, that they had a well laid out city, but there's no evidence of palaces or even of temples, that it seemed like everybody was nearly equal. In the case of the Assyrians, according to their own records, they started out as a classless society. Now, there was one group of people who strongly disagree with that. Your Soviet Assyriologists or your Soviet ancient historians, because according to Karl Marx, mankind would not become classless until some time in the future. That there had never been a time in the past. Now, of course, personally, I can say we'll kick Karl Marx out of the picture, and I'm going to believe what the ancients said. But nevertheless, it was like Karl Marx dreamed up the way history was, and all of a sudden you open up the history book or discover something, and hey, this is not the way Karl Marx said it was. But the Assyrians appear to have started off as a somewhat of a classless society, but then they had to develop strong upper classes as they had to fight off invaders. So basically what you have is a society where that you had the king at the top, very, very powerful, and around the king would be governors, or helping to control would be governors, and then everybody else was dirt poor. Everybody else was nearly equal. But at the top, they had classes. They had the king and they had the high up nobles who were the governors. Super, super high upper class and a very, very low lower class with nobody in between, which is what a lot of societies have become down throughout history. Anyway, I just thought I'd throw that in for good measure because we're going to run into it again next Monday when we start the chapter on India. What was the original society like? Did they have a near classless society? All right. Again, your book mentions that the power of the kings was very absolute. They had a very strong army, but as is a case of all peoples, eventually new methods of fighting were developed. And folk, a lot of times, winning a battle can be the worst thing that can happen to you because you start winning and you think, hey, we know how to do it, we'll do it the right way. The losers have to regroup and think, hey, you know, what did we do wrong? The losers come back. And I'm thinking particularly of the American Civil War where the South won battle after battle after battle, and the North, who kept losing, had to figure out new ways of approaching the fight. In the long run, the new methods benefited the North, and the South fell to the wayside. I mean, that's just one example. Another example might be in your athletic teams. Tom Landry was a coach of my generation many years ago, and he won 2 Super Bowls. Went to a couple of others. But he coached the same old way year in and year out. Then the last couple of years he coached his team, won about 3 games. Why? He was coaching the way I know how to coach. Look, I mean, I got 2 Super Bowl rings. Hey, but Tom, things are different today. You've got to innovate. No, I got 2. I know how to do it. His team would win about 2 or 3 games. They finally fired him, got a new coach, and they started winning more games. Again, a lot of times, doing things the same old way, losers don't. Losers innovate. Winners oftentimes don't innovate. And in the case of the Assyrians, as is the case of all of these ancient peoples, they did not innovate. But also a few things went against them. The Persians, Babylonians, and Egyptians got together and finally defeated them. And at that point, they largely disappeared from history. Now, They did try to reassemble as a nation and set up a government and a kingdom, but they were squelched every time. And it has been at least probably 2,200 years since they last tried to form their own country. And I'm waiting for the day when I hear the news that they're going to form their own nation again. I talked to a student from Iraq who knew about the Assyrians, but they just aren't powerful enough or strong enough yet to get together to form their own country. But nevertheless, they are there. They're right in the region that's making a lot of big news right now. So keep an eye out for them. Anyway, they largely disappeared from history. And a new group took over, the Babylonians. Now, the Babylonians, we talked about before, they were strong under Hammurabi. Between Hammurabi and Nebuchadnezzar, there was a period of probably 1,200 years, during which time Babylon languished, and they would look back at the days that one time we were powerful, one time we were strong. Folk, a lot of people do this. I mean, you know, during World War II, Mussolini, who ruled Italy, who wanted to reconquer rebuild the old Roman Empire, looking back on a time when the Greeks do this. Look back on a time when Greece was really strong. The Macedonians. Hey, every Macedonian is an expert on Alexander the Great, man and woman alike. If you go to Macedonia, everybody can tell you all they know, which is considerable, about Alexander. They look back on that time. Well, the Babylonians spent 1,200 years looking back on the days of Hammurabi, and finally Nebuchadnezzar was able to rebuild the empire. He is remembered for conquering Judea. And something else, Nebuchadnezzar has made news in my lifetime also. Saddam Hussein claimed that he was descended from Nebuchadnezzar and descended from Saladin. He claimed he looked like Nebuchadnezzar, even though I personally can't see the resemblance. I mean, these men wore thick beards and had their face and hair pretty well. I mean, their hair covered them up so much that Saddam Hussein wore a modern hairstyle. Nevertheless, Nebuchadnezzar and another man we'll talk about at the end of the semester named Saladin, both of these men conquered Jerusalem. And again, Saddam Hussein had dreams that he was going to go in and reconquer Jerusalem. Now I will say this about Saddam Hussein also, that you have to look hard to see, but it's there, folks. You can't find it. Saddam Hussein spent millions of dollars starting to rebuild the city of Babylon. Babylon is still not very well inhabited, but Saddam Hussein had dreams of restoring it, rebuilding it. A lot of people didn't like that. What he's doing, he's covering over the old archaeological sites, leave it alone. But nevertheless, he had dreams of rebuilding the city. To me, there were a lot of implications about that. Babylon's, the people there still look back to the old times when Babylon was once very, very great, very mighty. The last time it was mighty was under Nebuchadnezzar II. Don't worry about this part about the second, but just simply remember that name. Anyway, just a few years after Nebuchadnezzar died, a Persian king defeated him, a Persian king named Cyrus, whom we'll talk about next. All right. Babylon fell in importance when Cyrus took over. Now, with Cyrus, you have a new group of people, a new ethnic group. I don't want to use the word race, but the Indo-Europeans were coming in. Now, the Indo-Europeans are sometimes called Caucasians because they came from this region here called the Caucasus Mountains. And about 1800 BCE, they began to fan out. One group of them went down here and became the Medes and the Persians, Medes and Persians together. Another group of really related to them came down here and became the Aryans of India, which we'll talk about come Monday. And then later, at the same time, a group left this region and went over and settled in Greece, and another group was settled in Italy, and another group was to go on and settle in Spain. But basically, these Indo-European peoples began to fan out. And folk, yes, when we talk about China, we'll talk about this also, we do find, and this is something that's new, but we find Indo-European peoples in China it turns out by the thousands, indicating that Chinese are a mixture of European as well as stock from this region of Africa, Northwest Africa. And in fact, it looks like the Chinese, we got to China by going through Africa and starting out in Egypt. and going through Arabia and then through India and found their way into China by means of this route, or some of them might have just taken an overland route. Even though that's difficult to do, it's easier to go by sea. But some of them started out in the Caucasian region and went in and settled China from there. But anyway, the Indo-Europeans began to fan out. But the group I want to talk about now is they were called the Medo-Persian Empire. They were two separate ethnic groups, the Medes and the Persians. Now, in the story, the king was a Median. And in those days, you became what your father was. So if your father were Median, you'd become Median. If your father were... Now today, some groups have reversed this and said, no, you become what your mother was. But in those days, if you became what your father was, well, the Median king did not have any sons, but he had a daughter. His daughter married a Persian man, which meant that unless this Median king could ever have a son, the next king was going to be Persian. Well, the father, the king that is, put young Cyrus, the baby born to the union of his daughter and a Persian man, put young Cyrus in a boat and floated him down the river where some shepherds found him. The shepherds said, we need to find out where this boy is from. And they eventually learned that he was the king's grandson who had been floated down the river to get rid of him. They told him he was the king's grandson, and eventually a bunch of persons believed it and started following him. And Cyrus was able to build up a big army. Now, you might think that I'm about to say that Cyrus went in and killed his grandfather. No, Cyrus was known for his leniency. He did overpower his grandfather, but he told his grandfather, you're free, you can roam the palace, but I'm the king. You're not, but otherwise you're free. Now, there are two stories about this. There's another story that he put his grandfather in exile and said you could be a governor of one distant province. So again, we don't know which story is true, but and it doesn't appear that he killed his grandfather. His grandfather lived to the age of 104. Anyway, Cyrus became the emperor. Now, psychologists might explain this better than I can, but a lot of times, even the most powerful of emperors have been henpecked at home. And Cyrus is known to have married a woman who had been born into royalty, even though Cyrus himself had royal blood in his veins. But nevertheless, Cyrus had grown up as a shepherd. So he married a woman who knew all about being royal and knew all about the sophistication and the trappings of royalty and all the manners that a king was supposed to have. And she told him, you must conquer. You're a mighty king. You're ruler of the strong, and you have to go out and civilize these other people. You must get your armies together and conquer. So with her influence, he went out and conquered. And he helped to destroy the Babylonian Empire. Now again, he did not destroy the city of Babylon. The city of Babylon gradually out of its existence. But he went in and conquered Babylon, and the people of Babylon the next day went about their business as usual. Babylon gradually faded out of existence. Cyrus then is remembered mainly for allowing the conquered peoples to have been conquered by Assyria and by Babylon to return home. Very important, because in the first year of his reign, he issued a decree that the Jews who had been conquered by Nebuchadnezzar were to be allowed to return home. Not every one of them did. Some of them set up prosperous businesses, but more than 1,000 of the upper-class Jews returned home. And during the reign of Cyrus and the kings after him, they rebuilt their walls and rebuilt their temple and began to set up a nation. And this nation was to last until it was destroyed by Romans in AD 70 and again in AD 135. But he allowed other conquered peoples to return home, and in fact, unlike the Assyrians, he ruled by benevolence. And unlike the Assyrians, he did not have problems with rebellion. Not nearly to the extent that the Assyrians did. Anyway, the Persian Empire, after Cyrus went on, they conquered Egypt, and eventually their kingdom covered this area from Egypt all the way to the borders of India, and even part of India. They did not get all of India. But it was the biggest empire that man had seen at that time, bigger than the Sumerian empires had ever gotten, bigger than Babylon, bigger than Assyria, bigger than Israel had ever gotten. Biggest empire at that time, and it was the last 200 years. Now again, I'm not going to ask you to learn the names of any of the kings except for Cyrus, and later, when I come to chapter 4, I will ask you to learn the name of the last king of Persia before it was conquered. It was Darius III. Don't worry about that yet. But Darius III had the misfortune of meeting Alexander the Great in the battlefield. And I had a Persian man sit in my class, and I said, hey, Darius III was the second best general in all of history. He just happened to meet with Alexander, who was the best. Otherwise, Darius III was a really good general, a really good fighter, a really good soldier, but he goes down in history as a loser because he was opposed by Alexander the Great. All right, be that as it may, Cyrus left in his tomb a message. He said, now, on his tombstone had, for you who may come after me, and I know you will come. I conquered all the world while I was alive, but now that I'm gone, if you will please just let me have this little bitty space where my body is buried, and leave me alone, I'll be content. Alexander went, Alexander saw the tomb, and realized that Cyrus had been a great conqueror himself. Alexander left the tomb alone. Later, somebody opened up the tomb and found it empty. Apparently, the body was stolen somewhere along the way. Unlike some of these other conquerors, we at least know where he's buried. In the case of Alexander, Genghis Khan, Gilgamesh, we don't know where they're buried. Alexander the Great. Again, your book mentions that Cambyses conquered Egypt. Don't worry about that. Then after Cyrus came a few kings named Darius. Darius, Artaxerxes were the names of their kings, one after another. With Cyrus, again, the Persians took over, and the place was called Persia because Cyrus was, after all, a Persian, and the Medes took the background. All right. One thing more I'll say about the Persians, they had a really good postal system to where they had horses stationed all along the way, and the keepers were expected to keep a fresh saddle horse. And when the king or somebody sent an important message, he would ride till his horse got to it. He'd ride to the next horse station, drop off his horse here and pick up a fresh horse and ride again, drop off his horse to the next station. And every horseman could get, or rather the message could get from one side of the empire to the other in about a week, which in those days was extremely fast. Again, the horses were kept constantly on the move. You might wonder about your riders. Well, at a certain point, a rider would simply drop off his mail and go to sleep and let the next rider take his mail and carry it all night long until the following day, or and then another rider, he'd get off to another rider. But the message would keep on going until the message could get from one corner of the empire to another in a matter of a week's time. Now, this becomes very important when you come to the book of Esther, because the messages were able to go from one part of the empire to another with really remarkable speed. Now, which brings us up to their religion. When you come to Persians, it's like all of a sudden you find, after the Hebrews, their religion was almost monotheistic. Their god was Ahura Mazda. Now, and also, like the Hebrews, their religion was connected with the morals. Now, folk, there have been persons who have wondered if, all right, in this, one of the Bible stories, story about Esther. Esther married into Persian royalty. And some people wonder if Esther did not influence the Persian people to adopt a religion that only worshipped one God and was associated with morals. Be that as it may, according to the Persians' account, now their prophet was Zoroaster. Now, Zoroastrian religion, it emphasized a continuing battle between good and evil. On the one side was the good, led by Ahura Mazda, their god, And against him was evil, led by various powers of darkness. And they believed that eventually good would triumph over evil, but in the meantime, we could expect that evil would win half the fights. Evil and good were very evenly matched. And good would have a very difficult time triumphing over evil. But it was up to each individual to make sure he sided with the good, and this would help good to triumph over evil. Persian boys were taught two things: to handle the lance or the spear and speak the truth. Handle the lance and speak the truth. The Zoroastrian religion, again, sounds a whole lot like Judeo-Christianity. And it's difficult to tell, hardly to tell the difference. Even though, sadly, I must say, Zoroaster's religion did not survive the onslaught of Christianity that came later. And then Islam treated it even worse, and Islam forced Zoroaster's followers to retreat into India, where they set up a colony in India that's still there to this day, after they had been driven out of Persia. Some went to India. But you don't find Zoroaster in Persia hardly at all anymore. They were driven out. The Christians did not drive them out, but the Muslims who came later did. The last time I researched Zoroaster, there are persons who even raised the question, did this man ever exist? We know almost nothing about his personal life. And when would he have lived? Well, anywhere from 650 BCE to 1000 BCE. Again, we don't even have a time frame for it. Not a reasonable time frame, maybe within a 50-year period. Did he exist? Did he live? Again, these are questions that we simply have a difficult time answering. All right. And again, a lot of persons will say that when the Jews went into captivity, they were influenced by these religions, and that's why their religion took these, has a lot in common with them. But more recently, scholars have said, no, the Jews actually were practicing these beliefs long before they were carried into captivity, and therefore you can't say, did the Jews influence the Persians and the Babylonians, or did the Babylonians and Persians influence the Jews? Again, that question is still open. The concept of heaven and hell, again, we find that in Zoroaster also. A final judgment, we find that in Zoroaster's writings also. All right. We're going to close out chapter 1. Again, I've spent more time on chapter 1 than I've ever spent before, but I'll spend the rest of the time period, about 15 minutes I left, by way of review. The reason I spent so much time on chapter 1 is it appears to me it's very relevant. What they did then strongly influences us today. And this part of the world, right in here, is making a lot of news in the 21st century. And it did not make very much news when I was a kid. But it is now. So it seemed like it's important. We need to understand their beginnings. Then, of course, I'm going to spend 2 chapters on Islam. Next time we come and visit these people, they'll be under the influence of Islam. And again, very relevant. All right, leaving that, who knows anything at all about Hatshepsut? Yeah, you do, I know.
She was
Queen of
Egypt.
Egypt. Again, yeah, Queen of Egypt. And took over Egypt when her son was quite young. When her husband died and her son was quite young. There were a couple of Chinese rulers who did the same thing. Egypt and China has a lot in common. They both wrote their history based on the dynasties. To me, their writing looks alike. Hieroglyphics and Chinese writing looks alike. And they had a lot of the same stories, and the DNA seems to indicate that the Chinese people may have come from this part of the world before settling in China. All right, leaving that, Talk about a cataract. I mean, a cataract is a blurred vision that older people get caused by growth in the eye. But what's a cataract mean in connection with the lesson we've studied?
It's like the tier.
It's a terrace, like where the land flows level for several miles and it has a sudden drop off. Terrace style. The continent of Africa, every one of the rivers of Africa have cataracts except for possibly the big Congo. That made Africa very difficult to explore because explorers would go up a river a ways and then have to disassemble their steamboat, carry it around the cataract, and then reassemble their steamboat and go up the river until they got the next cataract. And it made Africa an interesting, difficult place to explore. All right. Who was Gilgamesh? Yes.
Did you write the names of the board when you
I have written them down before, but I can write them. I mean, just take more of your own time. Gilgamesh. Maybe the question is, who was he? Heart, 2/3 God and 1/3 mortal. He was a king of, anybody recall what city? King of Uruk. U-R-U-K. One of you put down he was a Sumerian king. I wouldn't count off for it. I'd be tempted to give you extra points, so if you put down Uruk. U-R-U-K. Anyway, 2/3 God and 1/3 mortal, and may have been, if you can leave the picture we have of him, 12 or 13 feet tall. Again, what you believe about that depends on your worldview. Which ancient peoples we've talked about seem to have a really strong fascination for cats? The Egyptians. A lot of their gods had cat heads. And of course, a lot of them had falcon heads also. Oh yeah, I'll say this, folks. If you will look at a link that I made to today's class, you'll find some of these same questions, except I asked to have morning class. What I'm saying, you're welcome to look at what I said in the morning class, which is already online. And so when this lecture will appear online, probably sometime tomorrow. Maybe this evening, probably tomorrow. For those of you who are following me online. All right. Anyway, when we talk about the Fertile Crescent, what is the Fertile Crescent? Fertile Crescent. If you look on a map, it's somewhat crescent-shaped. The word crescent means like a partial moon, or a moon that's less than a quarter moon. It's this region here that involves the Tigris, Euphrates rivers, and the land of Canaan, or what is today Israel. This region right here, and it's where civilization is said to have begun. Fertile Crescent. Egyptian writing is known as hieroglyphics. Babylonian writing is called cuneiform. Now along came another group of people later, and they had a different kind of writing. They gave us the alphabet, but these people were the Phoenicians. The Phoenicians. All right. How come the Sumerian writings have lasted as long as they have? I mean, we have so many documents that go back. Why? They're written not on stone, that's close. They were written on clay, and then the clay tablets were fired up to make them hard. We still do that with pottery, vases, certain kinds of vases. We'll make it the way that it's been made for thousands of years, out of clay, form it, and then fire it up in an oven, make it hard. Well, the clay tablets were fired up and made hard, and they have survived in those old libraries for up to 3,000 years. Great big stone monument in England, the biggest one, is called the Stonehenge, made out of some fairly huge rocks. Yes,
You said in England?
the Stonehenge, I believe it's in England now. Yeah, it's in England. Also in England, I happen to see this. There's a picture on a cliff of a horse. What's the great picture of a horse? This picture is so old that nobody knows when it was put together, and it has survived hundreds upon hundreds of years of wind and rain and storms, and it's still fairly clear. Reminds you of the cave paintings. These cave paintings have survived in damp caves, and I'm not sure that any paint we have today could take the beating. These paints have survived for many, many hundreds into the thousands of years. Neanderthal. What do you know about Neanderthal? The word. Neanderthal. Prehistoric man. Yes. Ancient man. He's older than the Cro-Magnon man. Supposedly extinct. Even though there are persons today who say that there are a lot of persons carrying around Neanderthal DNA, and that the Neanderthal man was capable of interbreeding with modern humans, and often did. We find Neanderthal men and women buried with modern humans, as well as buried with the Cro-Magnon man who came later. Neolithic. What does the word Neolithic mean? New Stone Age. Anytime you see the word Neo, it means new. Neo-Babylonian Empire, the newer Babylonian Empire of Nebuchadnezzar. New Stone Age, where these people supposedly developed better stone tools or better stones. All right. What was the name of the Pharaoh who built the Great Pyramid, the biggest pyramid that Egypt had? Pharaoh, he goes by two names. He's sometimes called Khufu, Khufu, and sometimes called Cheops. Herodotus called him Cheops, called Khufu. All right. Now, something else I want to emphasize. The ancients had no conflict between politics, science, and religion. To them, they were all one and the same. They did not compartmentalize. Now, less than a year ago, we had a debate between a creationist and a non-creationist. The debate occurred February 4th between Ken Ham and Bill Nye. Such a debate could hardly have occurred in the ancient world. Again, monotheism can have conflict between science and theology. With polytheism, where if the sun is God, if the moon is God, if the river is God, if the wind is God, it's more difficult to imagine a conflict between science and theology. There was no conflict. Politics, I can name you several politicians who are members of a church that teach against, where the church officially teaches against abortion, but they'll stand up and say, I'm pro-choice. In spite of the fact, again, in the ancient world, that could hardly have happened. they all were supposed, whatever the king said to believe, that's what they all believed. They did not seem to have a mind of their own. They followed the leadership of their king. All right.
When are those talks that you talked about at the beginning of class?
Oh, they're on every Thursday night. I mean, okay, you go to iCollege, and you'll find them listed on iCollege. Let's see, the next one, of course, is January 29th, and they're located in, it's a Methodist church nearby. Again, all that info is on iCollege. I posted it there on Thursday. After I got it on Wednesday, I told the class about it. At least one of you attended, one person in the other class who happened to check iCollege attended. So I've had 2 persons attend so far. And again, we want to encourage you to attend. It's bad on us when we go to all this trouble to get a really high qualified speaker, and we assemble and nobody attends. Okay. Any other questions? What's that? Nubia? Nubia was located south of Egypt. Your book mentions it. The reason I'm not going to put it on the first test is it's going to be on a later test. But it won't be on first. But Nubia is this region right here. They copied Egypt. They built pyramids, but the pyramids were no more than 6 or 8 feet tall. And they had writing which we cannot decipher because we don't have enough. To decipher an ancient script, you have to have lots and lots of writing.